to post something online on social media, but we are actually going to start another book tonight. So, you know, we changed the name of the class because it's just Genesis, and we're not in Genesis.
Right.
We're in Exodus. So we decided we were going to call this new thing that we're doing Exploring Exodus. And you know, Exodus is an interesting book because it does have a lot.
Exploring Exodus.
It has narrative books, but it has narrative stories too. Oh no, it's going to take one second. I'm just doing it right now. Give me a weird thing that's going to go down. So, and it is, we're live almost. Yeah. So we're going to look at Exodus today, and again we'll probably do like one or two, probably 2 chapters a night on Wednesday nights. And over the next few weeks, I was looking at what we're going to be doing and what we're going to be looking at, and you know, the part of Exodus that's narrative goes from tonight when we kind of wake up in Egypt after Joseph and the family have all settled there. And we're going to see, we read in Genesis last week. And then we move in over the first 22 chapters or so. Exodus, the narrative really goes from Egypt to Mount Sinai. Then interestingly, the narrative stops. There is no more narrative until Numbers, in the sense that there's a couple of stories, there's a couple of little stories here and there, but there is no movement, there's no actual place they go to besides Mount Sinai for the whole rest of Exodus, from chapter 20 through the end, and then all the way through Leviticus, and then during the first few parts of chapters of Numbers. So it's interesting because we think about the Bible, the narratives in the Bible, and this is one of the reasons why we spend so much time looking at Genesis, because so many of the narratives are there. So many of the narratives are part of the book of Genesis. And the when we had a chance to look at the authors, which I only showed some of the time, obviously when it was really kind of important, material relevant to, it helped us understand what we were doing. I never did it just to show it, you know. I don't do it for that reason. There isn't as much in Exodus, so I actually looked at, you know, where the J authors, you know, narrative is in Exodus, where the E author and the author. There isn't a lot of going back and forth. There aren't those woven together stories like we have in Noah's story, or creation story, actually. The Noah's story, the Joseph story, so many other stories that the stories, you know, the different texts are woven together. We don't have that as much in Exodus. It doesn't mean that there are different authors there. The same authors that we identify in Genesis are actually in Exodus as well. We just don't see, there's not as much text from J.
So was Exodus written around the same time that it's Genesis?
If the parts of Genesis that are relevant
Right.
to us to understand, and then the parts of Exodus are relevant for us to understand as being composed by authors who had an agenda and had a style, then yeah, then some of it was written, some of Genesis was written maybe 950 BCE, and some of it was written probably 850 BCE. So some of it was written very close to King James. It was written maybe 100 years later. So I think maybe we'll look at it a couple of times in Exodus, maybe even today, but we really won't do it many times. There are some shifts in authorship in the book of Numbers that are interesting, that actually help us to understand the product of different authors, especially when it comes to the journey and the different accounting of tribes and the map, if you will. The route is somewhat different in different authors. again, normally it's not, you know what, I'm gonna show you something real quick, something I was looking at just before, a little bit earlier today. I'm gonna show you, hopefully I have it on this computer too. And that is a little bit of, show this. Let's, yeah. Here. Get it up here for everybody to see. Let's make sure this is showing this right now. This is a diagram of the sources. This is not necessarily the best diagram of the sources, but it is a diagram of the sources. Sorry, get that up there. And the different colors indicate the different authors: J, E, P, and D. And then the gray is the redactor, is R. And the redactor is actually pretty important. And the yellow is the P author, priestly author. And yeah, so Leviticus is all priestly author, right? Doesn't surprise us, that's the priest. But you can see there is priestly author in Exodus, and of course in Genesis, especially the first Genesis, first story of creation is really the priestly story. But we're also going to see it here, and there's a few things in here which I do want to just kind of show you, since you can see it, that in chapter 1 we actually have really four authors, and we include the redactor, four hands, if you will. We have the redactor, we have the J, a little bit of J, which is really one line. You have a priestly author. You have the E author, and then you go back to the J author for the story of Moses. But if you look at the J author, I mean, that's one verse, one line. If you look at chapter 2, the story of the burning bush, the story of Moses' wife, look at that. There's not a lot of other J until, we have a few verses in chapter 20, which a couple in 13 and 14, but not a lot. If you see that, the Exodus story that we have is really would not be the product of this author that wrote so much of Genesis. Because if you look at the P author, the J author is the P, that's a lot of Genesis. It's the J author. And J really does write the better stories, and the more captivating stories, Garden of Eden, with Adam and Eve, the story of Noah, all the great stories of Abraham, the stories of Jacob and his wives, the Redeemer story, all these great stories that we read. So this here, chapter 37, we looked at the story of Joseph, moves back and forth. The P author, the J author, the E author, it's woven together. So we don't have a lot of that in Exodus. You really don't. And it also shows us that the author that really is concerned with a lot of Exodus is this author in green that we oftentimes call the E author, who also tells a narrative, tells stories, but from a slightly different vantage point. And one would actually make an argument that the E author is the most pro-Moses, the one that's the most concerned with Moses. But I thought about this because as we look at the story of Exodus, one of the ways that we really see Exodus and experience Exodus the most is at Passover. And we really do, we did it, we did this kind of exploration and midrash and really looking at the story of Exodus at the Passover. But we look at it in the Exodus text, but we also look at it from the Deuteronomy text, the text that we have, we call the Great Midrash, the one that comes from Kitabo, the text from Deuteronomy chapter 28, which is a retelling of what happened in Exodus. And so even in the Torah itself, we have people and voices, Moses' voice, and to some extent the people who reflect on Egypt and reflect on this experience that we're going to look at now. I'm starting today, and over the next several weeks, we're going to have a chance to really kind of immerse ourselves back in Exodus in a more, in a way like we did with Genesis, where really we'll be able to look at it verse by verse and see what's going on here and understand that there's a mythic component to Exodus. There's a part of this which is, again, almost difficult to understand unless you look at it almost as an explanation, as a myth that explains how we are, who we are. But we really do believe, I mean, I say we believe, I mean, I think many people who study the Bible believe that an Exodus event did in fact happen. There was a leaving, there was an Exodus, there was a departure out of Egypt that really did happen. So even if there are mythic elements to it, there most likely would have been something like this. And that is, that's really important to kind of recognize as we jump in. So let's jump in. Let's take a look at the words, which begin the Ele Shmot, Bnei Israel. These are the names of the sons of Israel who came to Egypt with Jacob, each coming with his household. And so we have this list of names. But in Hebrew, the word of the name of the Bible, the book of this biblical book, is names, is Shmot. Ele just means these, right? So Shmot means the names. So these are the names of the sons of Israel, the tribal, the heads of what will be the tribes. So we establish right away that this is a story which is linking together the people who were the family of Israel, Jacob. And this story actually uses the opening line as both names for Jacob. The sons of Israel, Bnei Israel, who came to Egypt with Jacob, each coming with his household. So it's again, usually thought that this was the redactor, the editor that's kind of kicking this book off by linking it to the book that came before, to Genesis. And so we have this list of names. And let's look at them. Reuben, Shimon, Levi, Judah, Issachar, Zebulun, Benjamin, Dan, Naphtali, Gad, and Asher. The total number of persons that were Jacob's issue came to 70, Joseph being already in Egypt. Now that is the list that's given, the names that are given. Joseph, as you notice, is not listed. It says he's already there. So those are the tribes. The interesting thing, of course, is it's always, these lists are always different. I mean, the first four are the same, 4 oldest sons. But then as we go into the other sons, here Benjamin pops up here as the 7th when he's actually, as we know, the last. So this is not given in the order of birth, order of who had who, even though these ones start off with Leah. So again, we have another weird list, and it's not the list of the tribal portions, which would have included Ephraim and Manasseh instead of Joseph and Levi, because Ephraim and Manasseh kind of take those places and take on the tribal portions, which we do have, later on. We have Ephraim and Manasseh essentially kind of listed as tribes. These are the sons, and so this really goes by the children of Jacob. And it says the total number were 7. We have that in the book of Genesis. It ends with that 70 people came down with an accounting of who they came, or at least the 66 people that came down from Egypt. So there is this recognition that Joseph was already there, so the family comes out to 70, with Joseph definitely being included in that. Even if he wasn't living with them, he's included with them. And that's, of course, important, because the next line that we have is that Joseph died and all his brothers and all that generation, which, by the way, Joseph dying, he's not the oldest son, but there's a possibility that he died younger than his other brothers. And so Joseph died, then his brothers died, and all that generation died, meaning the lives of that generation. Now, the fact that Joseph would die first, even though he was younger, he's not the youngest. Benjamin's the youngest, but he's pretty young. He's probably 25 years younger than Reuben. This idea that he died younger is an interesting concept. It doesn't say that. I mean, it doesn't say that he died younger, but it says he died, and then it says his brothers died. So some people, the rabbis traditionally understood this to mean that Joseph did in fact die before him, which can fly. So they would say, what's the reason for this? And interestingly, their understanding of it was that Joseph, to some extent, because he was living a non-Israelite life, he wasn't living, the healthy life that his brothers were living. He lived courtier. He lived the life of the court, which meant he was eating and drinking more. He was not eating his traditional Jacob family diet. So this idea that his lifestyle contributed to an earlier death. We know how old he was. He was 110 when he died. Still pretty good. But not as old as his father, not as old as his grandfather. So is it possible that he didn't die he didn't die, he died younger than he should have? It's possible. All right, the generation is all dead, but of course, the reason that Joseph's death becomes critical is probably not because of that first, but because of what happens. The Israelites were very fertile and prolific. They multiplied and increased very greatly, so that the land was filled with them. Now, I will tell you that line should sound familiar. And one of the reasons why I showed you the connections between the different authors is that if these first 5 verses were written by the redactor, by the editor, the next author, which is the priestly author, kicks off here with Joseph died and all his brothers and all that generation. But the Israelites were fertile and prolific. He multiplied and increased. What's interesting about that language is that goes back to the first book of Genesis, the first chapter, the first opening words of the priestly author, right? Those same words, pru, with some added words, vayishretzu, and vayatzu. It became fertile and prolific, and they also multiplied and increased very greatly. Again, why is that familiar? Well, let's look back real quick. Let's look back real quick to Genesis chapter 1. What happens? God created life on earth. And God said, be fertile and increase. Pru or vu. It's the same words. Be fertile and increase. So that is also used here. God blessed them. God said to them, be fertile and increase. Pru or vu. So what the Israelites, at least according to this, you would say, this theme, this motif of very same words. They did exactly what they were supposed to do. They were fertile and multiplied. But what's interesting about these words is that when the Bible used them earlier, and it talks about animals that are Yishrei that are being very fertile, and they translate it as multiply and being prolific. Those are the words that are used for creatures. It's not people. So what seems to have happened is that the Israelites increased almost in non-human type ways.
Like buddy.
Like bunnies, as Mike said. It's much nicer than the other words that rabbis sometimes even use, which is they multiply like bugs, like roaches. Now, is that the Israelites looking at themselves and saying that, or is that them projecting what the Egyptians are saying about them? But this idea that they were multiplying at rates that were almost non-human, it has made the rabbis, even to this day, try to explain what happened, which is, how did we wind up with 600,000 men marching out of Egypt 4 generations later? If it was 4 generations, which is again one of the differences in the authors as well, how long they were actually there for. But we'll get to that. We're not there yet. We're not. When we leave, we'll talk about that, or at least when we get to being told they're going to leave. But right now, what we know is that they're multiplying and they're increasing very greatly. And the words that are used here are words that in the Bible go beyond just being fruitful and multiplying. That this is something that was unbelievable. Now, was this the way it was supposed to be? Here's an interesting idea, which is, did the Israelites have to be in Egypt to multiply? Will the land of Canaan sustain them? Or did they need to have an infrastructure that allowed them to multiply the way God wanted them to multiply? And so these possibilities kind of enter into our imagination, because we know that Egypt has more resources. It has the Nile, it has farms. It was during the Roman Empire, the breadbasket of the empire. Was it the
They were
place
also treated differently there. I mean,
you treated differently than they were in Canaan?
for a while,
Probably.
with the.
So Mike's point is they were also treated differently. Well, they definitely were treated very, very well. The Canaanites, let's put it this way, it seems to be a more precarious situation, yes, for the Israelites. But of course, they're much smaller there. They're just a family. So now they multiply so much in Egypt, they become so fertile that, again, I mean, I'll tell you, because they did math 2,000 years ago. They tried to figure out how could the Israelites have multiplied to literally millions of people. And so they said that every time that Israelite woman gave birth, she gave birth to like 9 or 10 kids. So they literally had litters of kids every time. And that's not one time, right? So every time, so one woman could have essentially like 100 kids. This was not the way things were supposed to be. Normally, we understand that's not gestational. It's not normal. So it was miraculous. I don't know what to tell you other than the Bible gives us these words, and the rabbis went to town on it. But they had to some extent, because if the Bible says there's 70 when they come in, and 600,000 men, which means, closer to a couple million when they leave, you got to get there, and you have to use exponential math in order to get to that. Can't be they have each had 10 kids. It doesn't work that way. Not quite. I mean, if everybody has 10 kids, it's still 70, 70 kids. It's, let's say it's 50 kids. You know, that were, let's say Jacob has 50 grandkids, right? The 12 tribes have, let's say, 50 kids. There's 70 people, and that includes the kids and Jacob. So let's say there's 50 kids, and then they had 10 kids. So the next generation is 500. Well, the next generation, they all had 10 kids, it'd be 5,000. It'd be fine. You're still not getting, that's a lot. Don't get me wrong, it's a lot. Right? But it doesn't get you into the millions. So you have to have like hundreds of kids, hundreds. The next generation, thousands. So that's what would have kind of had to happen for the generations. If it happens over hundreds of years, hundreds of years, it doesn't quite have to be as prolific. But there are literally 4 verbs used here. Pru, like shreitzu. So pru is one, shreitzu, yirgu, yatsnu. And then it says ma'od, which is a lot. Not just ma'od, a lot. And it says the whole earth was filled with them. The earth was filled with them. So that's how we got to have so many people. But here's the critical line, which is this one line. A new king arose over Egypt who did not know Joseph. And that's all it says. Lo yada et Yosef. He did not know Joseph. So look, we understand this to mean it wasn't just a simple matter of, I've never heard of that guy. This is a willful ignorance of the man who helped save their country. So why did this happen? You know, some people say it indicates a shift in dynasties. There was a new dynasty in Egypt that took over, didn't know. It wasn't just one new generation, but literally a whole new regime. And they had that. They had dynastic shifts in Egypt where another family, or in some cases, a whole other people came in to rule. So is that a possibility? Is this little line here an indication that there was a complete shift? Look, what we do know from Jewish history is that that simply did happen. So when people say, is Genesis true or not? I don't know what to tell you other than can't prove it factually. But I know the truth of this line, that every time Jews got comfortable in the country throughout the last 2,000 years, all it took was one new person to come into office who changed the whole situation in some cases, where the situation went from being very comfortable to being completely precarious. If it was a gradual thing, then you'd say, well, you kind of saw it coming. But literally, sometimes a new king will come in and literally say, well, we're not paying the Jews the debts we owe them. We're going to kill them. As Mike was saying, King Edward in England, 1290 said simply, they're out. We're killing them. They're out. They're done. They're out of this country. So, Mary's cousin. Well, Edward Longshanks, he was a very tall guy. He was also brutal to the Jews, and of course, as our friend Mel Gibson told us, he was not very nice to the Scottish. But the situations throughout Europe and throughout the Arab world and throughout pretty much every place where the Jewish people live, oftentimes hinged on one person, whether they were well inclined to letting Jews stay in their country. And sometimes the Jewish community would wake up to find that they were not allowed to live where they had been living for generations. It happened in Spain, it happened in Russia. So we talked about the Pale of Settlement, where Catherine the Great, who was not so great to the Jews, decided to kick the Jews out of parts of Russia.
That was Catholic.
That was Catherine the Great. The Pale of Settlement was Catherine, forcing the Jews to live in Ukraine, Belarus, and Poland. So, yeah, it happened, and that was in the, you're talking about late 1700s, 1800s. They're not talking about, the 1300s and 1200s. Catherine the Great, that overlaps with American history and with, colonial, early colonial days in America. There were still Jews getting thrown out of countries in the 1800s. So the precarious situation of having a new king arise who doesn't know who we are is in the back of our minds at all times. And I think when we're really in those quiet moments, wondering what American history will be like 100 years from now, we are not so sure. Not so sure. I think if we're honest about it, we're not so sure. So, this is why we have an Israel, so that we can control our own fate. It's not that it's the end of the problems, but it's the end of this problem. It's an end of this problem. When a new king would arise who doesn't know us, and who decides to obliterate the people who saved them. The descendants of Joseph's family, the man who saved Egypt, who elevated the dynasty through his intelligence and through his foresight and through his miracles, is now watches. Maybe he was not there for it, but we watch this flip. And again, the hardest reality for us to know is that this happened to the people who are still alive in Nazi Germany. Because the Weimar Republic in the 20s and 30s had several very prominent Jewish politicians and leaders and economic figures, celebrities and entertainers, athletes, who ended up being murdered in camps. So when I read this, it's very hard for me to ever not think about the Weimar Republic and the fact that Germany that had so much benefit from what can we say? Arguably one of the greatest minds that ever lived on this planet had to flee Germany because of Hitler.
With his audio.
Given to Germany, to his native country. He was born in Poland. He was born in southern Germany. What would have happened to Germany if they hadn't been anti-Semitic, if they hadn't forced Einstein out of the country? So, this is the line.
I'm assuming though, this new king was a couple generations after Joseph passed.
Because, like I said, a couple of generations after.
Well, because, I mean, even one generation, they would know whoever came in, regime came in would know who Joseph was.
So yes, so if we understand this literally, that
Right.
Joseph was known, yeah, you'd think it would take a while, generation or two at least. But is it literally that we didn't know, or we didn't want to know?
Didn't want to know, could have been that too.
We didn't want to know. What we know about the Egyptians from their archaeology, from our archaeology now, is that the Egyptians had the ability to literally carve people out of history. They had a queen, Hatshepsut, she made herself pharaoh. She consolidated power. She was very smart, very powerful. She consolidated power. She ruled as a pharaoh. She actually had her picture engraved on the walls of tombs and building projects that she made. But when they got rid of her, yeah, they called her pharaoh. And when she got ousted and when the new pharaoh took over, They carved her name everywhere where her carving was, they carved her out. You can literally see the hieroglyphics of where they carved her name out.
They carved her out.
Carved her picture out. Isn't that crazy? So we know the Egyptians.
So how do we know about her then?
Well, we put some stuff together, right? And so I'll show you. I'm going to show you one of the chiseled out things of Queen Hatshepsut.
I can see it's all chiseled out.
We just took her. We've actually found her. She lived about 150 years or so before Moses. And I will say, very interesting story about her. And I'll show you some of the hieroglyphics.
What you're doing, I can tell you, the Dodgers are up 3-0.
I can tell by your face it was good.
Smith hit a 3-run.
I'll show you how they released. Let's show. Let's see. So yeah, so we uncovered her burial coffin and found some stuff of hers, but like. Every time I try to look up on the hieroglyphics, it zooms out. It doesn't show. Well, let's see. Okay. I think I can share this. Every time I zoom out, it pops away. So down here, you can see I just chiseled it. Trying to you see it right there? Just carved it out, carved her name out. So the Egyptians could do this. They were known to have this, but it's not just her. I mean, that was just a famous one because she was so controversial. But yeah, they could make somebody not known anymore. And this is the scary issue of putting everything online, right? Is that if we put all of our history online, get away with books and records and things like that, think about how easy it would be for someone to edit someone out of history. I mean, it wouldn't be easy, but with the bots and the things that we have today, you could scrub the internet of somebody. So,
You people I'd like to.
well, the point is that this is something that we can do more effectively today once we have the internet. I mean, think about how quickly we can crush them. We could take someone who's a hero and make them nothing in a moment with the power that we have now. So, what does this mean? He said to the people, look, the Israelite people are much too numerous for us. Let us deal shrewdly with them so that they may not increase. Otherwise, in the event of war, they may join our enemies in fighting against us and rise from the ground. And so this charge that the Israelites would become a fifth column within their country, first of all, indicates that the Egyptians were concerned about this issue, which is probably happened. It's probably happened to the Egyptians. If it didn't happen to the Egyptians, it happened in other places as well. Look, sometimes the fear of this happening is enough to get people to respond and do things that they otherwise wouldn't do. So, look, we see this charge less about the Jews today, but we had it in the 50s and 60s when Jews were accused of being communists, or in some cases today when they're accused of being serving Israel and not the United States. It's not an issue for us because Israel and the United States are great friends, but what if it wasn't? So this was a problem for the Egyptians, that there were so many of us. So Harvey's saying that the mic is still creating a lot of echo. I think it's because I'm speaking right into the mic. What do you think? All right, Harvey, I'm gonna back away from the mic a little bit. I just wanted to talk into it more because people said they couldn't hear yesterday. So anyways, can you hear me okay, Joyce? Joyce,
What?
can you hear me okay?
It's more of a mumble with a little bit of an echo. I don't think it's your fault. I think it's the system. Can you hear clearly?
See, I can hear Joyce clearly.
No, can you hear the rabbi clearly?
No.
Can you, Cheryl?
No, it's just what you described.
So,
Okay.
so
It's not clear with a little bit of an echo and a mumble, and everybody hears it, not just Joyce.
So here's the issue. Here's the issue. We can hear you perfectly.
I know.
It's not on the Zoom. It's not on the Zoom issue. It's on the mic. So it must be on the Zoom.
You know, when you're back a little farther, it sounds better than when you're right in front of the mic.
There. Okay.
Hold
So-
on, hold on.
Yeah, but now we're getting the echo from the Mike's got it on his phone. So the idea that the Israelites would fight against the Egyptians, they would not be good citizens, you know, this doesn't seem to be based on any reality. There's nothing that we've seen where the Israelites are not good citizens in Egypt.
Uh-huh.
But the fear of what would happen is going to be enough for Pharaoh to rally his people. And, you know, the translation, what's the King James translation, Mary, for let us deal shrewdly? It's probably similar, right?
Let us deal wisely.
Let us deal wisely. Yeah, the word chachama is like chacham, right? Smart.
Mm-hmm.
Crudely implies, you know, a little bit more deviously, but there is this idea of, you know, we have to do something. Let's use our heads here on how we're going to do this.
Mm-hmm.
And so there is this sense that they have to do something, the Egyptians, and they have to use their brains in order to counter this increase in with the Israelites. Now, I will say this, that this author seems to be saying, and again, this is why it's an authorship issue. This author seems to be worried about the increase happening, where we've read before in the chapter, in the earlier, you know, verse 7, that it already happened. So is it possible, again, that this is just a slightly different tradition, that the Egyptians are worried about this first, and then it happens? Or did it happen and then they responded to it? Because if they already increased, then why is he saying it so that they don't increase? And you can say so they don't increase further. But it seems like, at least in the description before, is that it's already happened. Could be that this is a little out of place and that, you know, we're supposed to understand that as this was happening, the Egyptians are starting to freak
Or
out.
like you said, it should be, so they may not increase further.
Yeah. But it seems like to some extent the damage is already done. We're already increased. We've already increased. So here's what the answer is, right? They set taskmasters over them to oppress them with forced labor. And so they built garrison cities for Pharaoh, Pitom and Ramses. So it does not say, as we remind people every year at Passover, that the Israelites built pyramids. They did not build the pyramids. There might have been pyramids part of these building projects, but the pyramids that we know of at Giza, Cheops, those pyramids were there for 2,000 years already. Those big pyramids were part of the building project from previous dynasties in ancient history. And as much from those pyramids as we are from
So now we lost. Frozen.
than about 30 feet.
Oh, there we go.
You hear me? Okay. All right. We don't have buildings in Europe higher than about 30 or 40 feet for about 5,000 years, 6,000 years after the Egyptians. That's how advanced they were. But here's the problem for the Egyptians. The more they oppressed, the more we increased, the more they increased and spread out. So that the Egyptians came to dread the Israelites. And so here we have this understanding that the Egyptians came to fear us because of our numbers. And the strange thing, of course, was the harder they oppressed us, the more we increased. So it had the opposite effect of what they were trying to do, which is trying to stop us from increasing by oppressing us with work, but it's not working. That's not working. Then it says the Egyptians ruthlessly imposed upon the Israelites the various labors that they made them perform ruthlessly. They made life bitter for them with harsh labor, with mortar, bricks, all sorts of tasks in the field. And that is the word Beth, which we talk about at Passover. What was it like, this harsh work? This maror, the bitterness of this word. That's why we have maror. This is why we have harosa, to remember the mortar and bricks. But it also says that we worked in the field. Now, some people say, well, they had to make the mortar and bricks, so they had to cut down the grass to make the bricks. Possible, but it's also possible that that was also part of the work. Look, this is fairly long part of this story. I mean, this is 1, verse 11, 12, 13, 14, 15. If you think I'm making a big deal about this, watch when we go into the story of Moses, how precious 5 verses are. We have 5 verses here about this work. And so that's why we talk about it so much at Passover, because it must have been horrible. And it captures our imagination because it doesn't just say they worked us. It doesn't just say that they made us build cities. It has us ruthlessly imposed work on us, which the rabbis explained, and we actually talked about this at Passover, that part of the goal of the work was to keep the men away from their women, from their wives, so they couldn't have babies. So imposing work on them to break their spirit, to break their physical bodies, so that they wouldn't want, or they couldn't have the energy to literally to reproduce. That's one of the understandings of what this is, that this is backbreaking work, physically and emotionally draining. But the rabbis also interpret this in an interesting way, that making life bitter for them with these kinds of tasks, of course, taking them away from whatever jobs they had, whatever things they wanted to do, they couldn't do anymore. That's part of what being a slave is all about. But we know the Egyptians did this to their own people. We know from records that they had forced conscription where they either had people working for a fixed period of time, maybe a month, a year, as a kind of a tax to work for the state, or they just took people into slavery. We know the Egyptians did this. we found the villages that they built for their slaves or for their work crews. The rabbis also interpret that one of the things that made this so hard for us wasn't just the physical, emotional toil of working and not being able to do what you want to do, but that some of the work that they made them do was in itself pointless and meaningless. And they'd have them do work which was nothing other than busy work and ridiculous work that crushed them because they never saw any benefit from it or the fact that it was benefiting anyone. And so literally making somebody do work that was nonsensical, turning a millstone that's not grinding anything, that kind of stuff. That's emotionally crushing too, just to think about that. I mean, but you understand. Anyone who's at a job where their job was meaningless because they knew that everything that they did didn't go anywhere, didn't have any effect on anything, that crushes people. You know? I think it's one of the conditions that people have talked about in the modern world, where people said that the work that they had, they didn't feel like they were producing it. At the end of the day, they never saw any benefit for the work that they did. They couldn't point to a car or to something that they made where they'd say, hey, I built that. Some people felt that way, feel that way. And I think a lot of people feel that way, especially, and actually there's some great writing about that, something that Franz Kafka's written about, and other people have written about it, especially bureaucrats, especially people that work in the government, who have people fill out forms for no reason. And those people have to read the forms, and they have to collect the forms. And so people oftentimes see that as some of the most meaningless and heart, soul-crushing work that people can do. So this is also part of the understanding of what happened here, is that the work that they did was meaningless. And that crushed them too. But again, all of these are possibilities, all based on this quite detailed explanation for what they have to do. But that wasn't working either. And so, and by the way, here, I will say here, is that here, it uses a melech hadash. It doesn't say the word pharaoh. It says the king. Here it says pharaoh. So, different hands at work here, possibly, which is why we have two versions or lots of text about the work that they did. But the point is that one of the things they did, once they saw that the work was stopping them from multiplying, and again, by the way, I mean, it pretty much says the work was there to stop them from multiplying. It wasn't to get the Israelites to do work for them. It wasn't, so hey, we have this great big labor force that we can use. It was, let's get them to stop multiplying by the work. And so what does it say that Pharaoh does? The king of Egypt spoke to the Hebrew midwives. One of whom was Shiphrah, and the other was Puah, saying, when you deliver the Hebrew women, look at the birth stool. If it is a boy, kill him. If it is a girl, let her live. The midwives, fearing God, did not do as the king of Egypt had told them. They let the boys live. So, you've got these women who are told to kill the boy children. With the idea that, of course, that if only the girls are left, then we don't have to worry about the Hebrews multiplying anymore. And here, of course, they're called Hebrews. They're not called Jews. They're not Jews yet. Right? You could say Bnei Israel, but he doesn't call them Bnei Israel. He calls them Hebrews. Which is interesting because Hebrew really is an ethnic designation, a linguistic, cultural designation as Hebrews. Now, the question that people have had for thousands of years is, who are these remarkable women who don't listen to the king, that literally risk their lives to save Jewish children? And we don't know anything about them other than their names. Shifra and Puah.
What does the Midrash say about
So the names are not really Hebrew names.
it? No, it's not.
So it's not, but it's possible. And I'll tell you why. Look, it says that there are Hebrew midwives. But that could be midwives to the Hebrews,
Right.
or it could be midwives who are Hebrew. Now, the Midrash goes, there's two different possibilities. The Midrash gives both of them. The one that they give, and I think most people sit with, is that these are in fact Egyptian women who risked their lives to save Jewish children, Hebrew children. They're the first righteous Gentiles. They're people who literally risked their lives to save Jews. They're the definition of righteous Gentiles. The rabbis are a little divided on that issue because there's another tradition which the rabbis like to also have, which is that these are in fact Hebrew women. They're just known by Egyptian names. And there's a very famous midrash that these Hebrew women are none other than Yocheved, Moses' mother, and his sister Miriam, that are known by the names Shifra and Puah in Egypt. They had different names. Moses had a different name. You don't know his Hebrew name. There's midrash on what his Hebrew name is. We'll get to that. But right now, it's very possible, as we're looking at this, that these women had Egyptian names and a Hebrew name. So were they Egyptian or were they Hebrew? Now, most importantly, they did something remarkable. They risked their lives to save the Hebrews. And so what happens when Pharaoh says to them? And by the way, it says they feared God. That's why they did it. They did it because they feared God. What they said, that's what it says. They feared God more than they feared the Pharaoh. And so the king of Egypt summoned the midwives and said to them, "Why have you done this thing, letting the boys live?" And the midwives said to Pharaoh, "Because the Hebrew women are not like the Egyptian women. They are vigorous. Before the midwife can come to them, they have given birth." So they lied. But they lied in a very clever way. They say, "Look, we get there, they've already given birth. There's nothing we can do." They're just like, they pop them right out. We go there, they're already done. It's already over. So what's the King James for vigorous? Lively. Lively is the King James. My friends, the word in Hebrew is even more clever. Because what the midwives really did is they actually used the Pharaoh's own anti-Semitism, if you will, against them. Because what they said is the Hebrew women are not like Egyptian women. So they concede they're not like us. Which again, if you're speaking to a racist, is a great way of making them feel comfortable. Oh yeah, they're those, those Hebrew women. And look at the word that they actually use. Ha-ivri ki chayot. See that? You know what chayot is? It's translated as vigorous, lively. It has the word life in it. But I have news for you. The word chayot is an animal. It could also be translated as the Hebrews are like animals. That's the translation I would use, by the way. I use that one. Because then these midwives are literally using his own racism against them. Which is they're like animals. They give birth like crazy and they don't need us. By the time we get there, they've already had the baby. Which is, I think, the intention of what they did, which is they very cleverly escape responsibility by saying, there's nothing we can do. So they didn't say, well, they didn't, well, I guess they lied, but they didn't just lie. They lied in a way that got them off the hook. So it's very, very smart what they did. So they conceded the racism. And it says that God dealt well with the midwives, and the people multiplied and increased greatly. So, Vayetev Elohim, that God was good to them. God was good to the midwives. They got rewarded, which is why the Midrash exists. Because first of all, as we know, the Midrash never likes people who we don't know where they're from. They don't like people just appearing on the scene and disappearing without any backstory and without ever any conclusion to the story. So what the Midrash does is it explains to Shifra and Puah by saying that they're, in fact, Yocheved and Miriam. Why are they going to be rewarded? Because Yocheved is going to be birth of Moses. That's what dealing well with these people will be, which is that they're going to be entrusted with Moses. Because it's not just Yocheved, it's also his sister, Moses. So this is the understanding of what happens to these midwives. Who are they? Well, there's a few possibilities. I like to imagine them as Egyptian. But there is this kind of in between them, which is that no, they're Hebrews, in fact. All right.
Rabbi, can I ask a question?
Yes.
Rabbi, can I ask a question?
Yeah.
How? And this is like the first question I've ever asked, but this really makes this. I'm trying to understand this. Can you scroll up a little to the names of the two midwives? It seems to me that these two ladies, Shipra, I'm not pronouncing correctly, and Puah, saved the Jews. Why are not more female? Why don't we see more first names from these? You know, in other words, you know, John and Mike and Shira and you know, it seems that they played a very important role in history.
It's a very good question. So Shifra is not a super popular name, but is a name that you'll occasionally see. You'll see occasionally Shifras. Really? Yeah. You will see Shifras, especially in the Orthodox world. And people know where it comes from because they know that this is the lady. Puah is a little less common. And I do think it's somewhat because the name seems, you know, onomatopoeia, like it does sound, you know, kind of weird. There is an interesting understanding that their names are actually like have meaning to them. But you're right, we don't see them a lot. I'm trying to think if I've ever met anyone whose name is Puah. I don't think I have. Shifras, I know Shifras. But the word Shifra actually has in it, you can hear the word shofar. So, you know, there's an interesting idea that, you know, somehow this name is like, is holy because of like the shofar, right? And so like the shofar kind of blasts out, you know, this sound of victory, that Shifra does that as well. You know, it's interesting because, yeah, Moshe is an Egyptian name that essentially becomes a Hebrew name. Esther is another name. I mean, Esther, we know, is not her name. The Bible actually says what her original name was. Moses' name, we don't learn. You'll see it right now. We don't learn what Moses' birth name was. We know his Egyptian name. We know what his adopted mother calls him. That's what we call him. But Esther actually says her name is Hadassah. It actually says it in the book of Esther, the name is Hadassah. She had a Hebrew name. And then she has this very Persian pagan name Esther, Ishtar, which is actually the Babylonian and Persian goddess of love, fertility. It's Aphrodite, Ishtar. So it's Venus. So what's so weird is that we have these names that are not Hebrew that make their way into our text. So why not that? It's one of the reasons why some people say that Shifra is actually a nickname for and again, it kind of goes with this last line, which we did not read, which is connected to this too, which is, and God established households for the midwives, which means batim. It's translated as households because it's connected to the word batim, because they feared God. And so God rewards them. So it says God dealt well with the midwives, and the people multiplied and increased. And it says that God, specifically what they did, what God did for the midwives, which is establish a household for them. So the rabbis kind of, what does that mean? And that's one of the reasons why it's possible that, Shifra is none other than Yocheved, Moses' mother, that is, if you're going to establish a household for somebody, a house for them, that's what it means. But this other idea that somehow Shifra and Puah are rewarded by God is an interesting idea that some of the rabbis who take on this idea that they're actually Egyptian and not Hebrew say that the Egyptians, that the descendants of Shifra and Puah wind up being pharaohs and kings in their own right. That the next pharaohs, if you will, are the descendants of Shifra and Puah, not the descendants, as we know. Why? Because Pharaoh's son is killed. He's one of the people who died. So, I don't want to read it for you, but we're going to read it in a few weeks. So maybe Shifra and Puah's lines are actually the next lines of the Egyptian monarchy, which again would fit well. If God's going to bless you, it's going to be something good. So maybe the next pharaohs are going to be descendants of Shifra and Puah. So the question of like how they get rewarded is an interesting one. And again, I think, there are a lot of people, especially as we talked about righteous Gentiles in the last couple of generations since the Holocaust, who really said, why don't we recognize these people why is Shifra and Puah to some extent should be the righteous Gentile, the model of the righteous Gentile, right? And so we have this wonderful forest at Yad Vashem, which is probably the highest way we can honor people is by having these trees planted, these plaques. They become enshrined in Israel. That's the way the Jewish people kind of have now said, when we find someone who's a righteous Gentile, we're going to honor them with this honor. And it's considered a pretty important honor in Israel. I know people who've gone back for the recognition of their families. And it is something, obviously they talked about the Schindlers, some of the people that we've seen movies about, Sugihara, the Japanese consul who rescued Jews out of Lithuania. There's famous ones that they've done movies about. But, we recently were talking about Meep, about the people who rescued Anne Frank. It was her birthday last week. It was Anne Frank Day. She was in 92 or 93. It was 80 years ago. So yeah, she would have been in the mid-90s. And the people who tried to rescue her, even though they weren't successful, they risked their lives for her. And so our people, people decided to name their kids Meep. I haven't heard it. Maybe it's just a weird name, but Meep would definitely be an honor. I know people who name their kids after Anne Frank. I know Annalise's. I really didn't name Annalise. They used to fall in. But it is an interesting thing to think of honoring those people. I don't know if anyone's ever named their kid after Oscar Schindler either, but yeah, that is one of the ways to honor and remember people is by naming them, by keeping those names alive. So it's an interesting thing. So John, if you ever have a daughter, you can Shifra. No, but Shifra is actually, I don't know about Puah, not encouraged. It's not that I'm not encouraged. It's a tough name to. Puah is a tough name to live in, especially in any country where poo is poo. So, anyways, it is. They God loved them, that's for sure. It says that God established households. And as we're gonna see, it didn't work, right? So Pharaoh charged all the people, saying, every boy that is born you shall throw into the Nile, but let every girl live. And that's the way the chapter ends. That's the last verse of chapter 1, which is that everybody has to be part of this. Because it says that Pharaoh charged all the people. So his attempt at reaching this kind of implicating and getting a small cabal of people to do his bidding and to help this. By the way, I just want to point out, if there's only 2 Hebrew midwives, Shiphrah and Puah, there aren't that many Israelites yet. I'm just saying, I mean,
So they're busy.
it's possible, but and this seems to be more of this understanding that they are increasing, or they're going to increase. It's going to happen rather than it has happened. But regardless, Pharaoh can't do that. It's not going to work. So he has to have everybody, and it becomes a national policy. So that every boy that is born you shall kill, throw him in the ground. So this is the way that they finally decide that we're going to be able to deal with this growth of the Israelites by killing the men. That's the last verse that we have, is throwing into the Nile. And that is the worst. It's not just murdering them, it's throwing them into the Nile, which of course is symbolic. And this will, of course, be part of the drama of what the Nile is in the next story. Now, I will tell you that based on this story, what we just read, it seems as though the Israelites and the Egyptians are living pretty close to each other, and at least the Israelites are in proximity to the Nile so that their babies will be thrown in there. Now, it could be that that's because they've been forced to move to this area in order to do the work for the pharaohs. So it is possible they lived in Goshen and now they're not living in Goshen. The only problem with that is that they're living in Goshen again in a couple chapters.
Really?
Yeah, so the Goshen issue is very important. So again, it's more likely that there's just kind of 2 different visions of where the Israelites lived when they were in Egypt. One, that they're mixed amongst the people. Because in reality, look, what this story seems to be talking about is Jews, Israelites, and call them Jews, they're us, they're our ancestors, but they're Hebrews, whatever you want to call them, in Israel. That they're living amongst the Egyptians. The other possibility is that they're living in Goshen in a separate area, which, by the way, if they're living in Goshen, it's really easy to do away with them because you just go into Goshen and kill everybody. But if they're living amongst you, it's a little bit harder. And again, it's a little bit more dramatic because what happens is that the babies wind up floating in the Nile River and everyone sees it. This is a murder, infanticide. This is murder that everyone witnesses and everyone is complicit in because it says all the people were charged, everybody. It's not like he just ordered his soldiers out to do it. He tells everybody, this is what you're going to do. That's what it says. Kol Amam, this whole nation. So that's where we finish chapter 1. So the chapter begins where there's 70 of us. We're living in Egypt with Joseph, inviting us. We're all down there. And by the end of the chapter, this is what we've come to, which is the wholesale murder of our people. And again, just so you understand what this really means, is that there are different ways to murder a people. And specifically, there were different ways to murder Jews. You put them on a train and you sent them to concentration camps in Poland. Another possibility, which is what happened in some countries, especially Hungary, in the last days of World War II, while the Hungarian government fell, the Nazis took over, and they got their allies and their thugs in Hungary to literally kill Jews and throw them into the cannon. which is why one of the Holocaust memorials that we saw are the shoes that are by the side of them. There's metal bronze shoes that are by the side of the river, which is one of the things that they would see. Hungarians would see the shoes of the people where they stood before they were murdered and thrown into the den. So this is, again, very visible of remembering that there's this happening, this genocide is happening in your own town, your own city. So now we're going to read Moses. So the chapter ends terribly, horribly. There's nothing worse than the murder of babies, I think. Pretty much ranks up there as the worst thing you can imagine. We now read this. This is what we're going to finish with. A certain member, Ish, a man from the house of Levi, went and took into his household as his wife a woman of Levi. And the woman conceived and bore a son. And when she saw how beautiful he was, she hid him for 3 months. Now, this is the birth story of Moses. It's 2 lines. Now, we haven't got to the basket yet. But this is all we know about Moses and his parents. And if you read real carefully with us just now, you don't have to read real carefully. There are no names here. His parents aren't named here yet. They're not named. And interestingly, it says that a man from the house of Levi took a woman who was also a Levi. The interesting thing here, and so if you look at Mike, he's already knows what I'm going to say here, is that we learn later that Moses' father's name is Amram, and he's a grandson of Levi, a grandson. But, which would make him a great-grandson of Jacob. But Yochebed, Moses' mother, it says, is a bat Levi. Now you can understand that to be literally a daughter of the house of Levi, which is kind of the way it says here. But it also, what does the King James say, right? Yeah, the daughter of Levi. That's the literal understanding of it by the rabbis, which is that Amram actually married his aunt. So Amram's father's name is Kohat. Kohat is one of Levi's sons. So if Levi has a son, Kohat, he has a son, Gershon, and he has a son named Merari. They're the Levites. Their tribes become sub-tribes of Levi. But if Levi also had a daughter, and her name is Yochebed, then this guy Amram, who's Kohat's son, married his aunt. Now that's a possibility. I mean, it could be that they were just, she was very young and, whatever. But it is a weird idea. Look, that's if we take it literally, the daughter of Levi is a daughter of Levi, not the daughter of the tribe of Levi. That's one of the reasons, that's one of the understandings of this, which of course means that Moshe is very much a Levi. He's a Levite, all through and through, on his mom's side and on his dad's side. That's probably the intention here, by the way.
Right.
But it also then poses a question: if his grandfather is Levi, then he's really connected, even in a way, he's both a grandson and a great grandson of Levi. And so this is an interesting idea that he is very connected to Levi, that he's not even that far removed from Levi. So, no matter what, he's very much a Levite on his mother's side and his father's side. Now, when we read this and say the woman bore him a son, right, and when she saw how beautiful it was, she hid him for 3 months. Now, if we understand this to be the fact that they already have 2 other kids, namely Aaron and Miriam, this is not their first child, if you will. Right? So there's another possibility, which is that she had another husband. But Moshe's father is a different father than the other 2. It's a possibility. The guy died, hard labor, who knows? But it does seem important that she does see that this child will live. Now she hid him, right? It says that she hid him. Now the translation that she saw how beautiful he was is from this Hebrew Tov. Now, what does the King James say for that name?
He was a goodly child.
He was a goodly child. That's what the word Tov means, right? It means good. But the problem is that because that word means so many things, it means good, beautiful, nice, proper. But it does seem to mean something else, which is that it works. In this case, the child is actually viable. So I hate that translation. It's the translation that they always use. But we know that good, that Tov doesn't mean just good or good looking. It's pretty, which is what this kind of says, how beautiful it was. I mean, that seems to imply like that if he wasn't beautiful, she wasn't gonna do, I really don't like the way this kid looks. Let's throw him in the river. I mean, that's insane. But I really think it goes back to the biblical words that we have at the beginning of the Bible, in Genesis. When God looks at something, he says, it's good. He doesn't literally mean, God's not, yeah, it's good. God's saying it works. That's why I like the translation better for when God created, light, and says, it's Tov. Because God is, it's good. God's saying it works. It's gonna work. This is it. That's what she sees when she sees the son. She sees Moses as a child who can live, which is why she was willing to risk her life in keeping him alive, because it was going to live. So this idea that it's beautiful and therefore we're going to keep it, it's so weird. It's kind of, it's not clearly the meaning of it. I would translate it. It's not as poetic, but viable. The child was viable. The child was going to live. Folks, we have to understand that in the old world of maybe 100 years ago and beyond, a child did not have a great chance of living. Talking about a 25% chance maybe that child was going to live. So when she sees the child's going to live after 3 months, she watches him, makes sure that that this child can live. So I really want to get this point across, which is something that's always been very important for me as a parent, but as a kid whose name was Moshe, I was like, wow, if I didn't look okay, was my mom would throw me out. But
She kept you, so,
she kept me. But it was scary.
probably need glasses.
His mom keeps him and makes sure that after 3 months, he's going to live. Because the next part of her plan, which is keeping him alive, is a lot more complicated.
I read into this. I know it says beautiful. And I know what you were saying, Bible. I looked at it as if she's looking at this child, because she's had 2 others, that he looks like divine, because we know what's going to happen later on. So that's kind of how I've always read that line.
So Mike, in case you didn't hear it, is that because he looks divine and he looks so amazing and so you're saying that that's why she kept him, because she already had 2 kids.
Right. Well, and he looked different than the other 2.
Oh, he looked different.
They
Okay.
looked divine, that he looked special.
So he looked different than the others. Okay, that's a possibility as well, which is that, she sees him. There is this understanding that when Moses was born, he gave off like a light. This was not just a normal baby. Look, a lot of the Jesus narrative, birth narratives, were borrowed from Moses. We'll talk about it in a moment. But this idea of Moses having some special powers that are evident even as a baby are very important. But again, that's a nice way of looking at it. It's one of the traditional ways of looking at it, is that Moses gave off a light. The midrash is that he gave light to the house. I mean, she was actually worried about how to keep him, because she's like shining. They're gonna find us. So this is actually an issue. It's a house This baby is gonna give everyone over. I thought it was interesting you made the point that she already had a baby or two. She had two, so maybe she wasn't normally would risk her life. Because remember, if she gets killed, who's gonna look after her kids? So this idea that a woman would have a kid, contrary to the law, knowing what she was risking is a possibility. And again, just knowing that your baby's gonna be killed, you wouldn't want to have a baby. So, yeah, this idea that Moses was somehow came out different is a very important idea for the rabbis. I like the idea that he didn't look that much different than anybody else, but she knew that this child would live. And so what she did is risk her life to keep her child alive. And then she comes up with this wonderful plan. When she could hide him no longer, she got a wicker basket for him and caulked it with bitumen and pitch. And she put the child into it and placed it among the reeds on the bank of the Nile. And his sister stationed herself at a distance to learn what would befall him. So this is the first indication that he has a sibling. We have she's not called by name, right? Which is why a Shifra and Pua idea here is, what's their names? Depends on who you ask. Don't even have their names here yet. But this idea that she couldn't hide him any longer. Why? Well, maybe again, this light kept going off. Every time she took him out to nurse him, that literally the house is lighted up. I can't keep this hidden anymore. So that's a possibility, baby's making noise now. She can't hide it any longer. By the way, this means that if Aaron was born, he was born before the edict to kill all the male babies, or maybe she's done this before. But this is clearly, again, we don't have a lot of information. We have 4 verses.
Oh, I always thought Moses was older than.
No, Aaron's 3 years older. Aaron is 3 years older. So when he dies, when Aaron dies, and Moses dies a little bit after him.
Oh, yeah, we know Aaron.
That means Aaron is going to be 123. So Aaron, not mentioned here, but Miriam is. And I also want to point out, again, don't have a lot of verses on this. So every word is critical. Every verse is important. Every line, every word, critical. It's very important to say that she did not put him in the Nile River. It says she placed him in the banks, the reeds. She placed him in a place where he couldn't move. So this idea that he's taken away by the Nile, looking like Prince of Egypt, which is a wonderful movie. And it's actually based on Midrash that, the basket doesn't stay where it's supposed to. But this idea that she pushes it, which is kind of in the movie, where she pushes it and lets it go wherever it's going to go, wherever God directs it. And then in the movie, it opens this great scene with, he's almost eaten by hippos and alligators and fishing nets combined, which they come up. But he somehow gets back to the reeds. Well, this is really important because what seems to really be it in the story is a completely different understanding of what happens with what Moses' mother and sister do, which is they know all along what's going to happen and who's going to be there, because they put him in a place where only one person can find him. And again, the sister's there the whole time. He's not by himself. He's not going down the Nile, whatever happens, happens. Now in the movie, they do have Miriam running along the Nile, looking over it. But that's different from this idea that, again, the sister is watching the whole time. The daughter of Pharaoh, here very clearly says Bat Paro, the daughter of Pharaoh, came down to bathe in the Nile while her maidens walked along the Nile. She spied the basket among the reeds and sent her slave girl to fetch it. When she opened it, she saw it was a child, a boy crying, and she took pity on it and said, "This must be a Hebrew child." So let's get something clear right away. The Bible says, this is not a midrash, the Bible says that she knows what it is right away. She does not, there's no question to her what's happening. She knows what happens. This is a Hebrew child. My father has been killing babies by throwing them in the Nile. And this is one that's in the Nile, but is alive. So think about it. It's not just a river, it says right here, the same place. It says Yahor, the Hebrew word for the Nile. It is the same river. So the same river that has been filled with Jewish babies, Israelite babies, Hebrew babies, our babies, now has a baby floating in it. And she knows what it is. She knows. And the baby is crying. The Bible says that. The baby's crying. Now, again, baby sitting in a basket by itself, of course, that's a natural thing. But the fact that the baby cried out, the fact that this baby is crying, think about the drama, the juxtaposition of that, which is here's a baby floating on the Nile crying. And all the babies down below that have been murdered. And again, just like Shifra and Pua, in this case, there's no question who she is. She's Bapara. She's the Egyptian. She is as high up as you can get without being the Pharaoh. Because remember, Bapara is not only Pharaoh's daughter, but also one day could be Pharaoh's wife. Because the Pharaohs did, in fact, marry their sisters. So is this the princess? Is this the queen? Is this a princess who's going to be queen? This is why we get these ideas, and you've seen them in the movies, whether it was Ten Commandments or whether it was Prince of Egypt, that the Pharaoh was married to the woman who rescued him. I will show you right now. Don't forget. I'm going to show you this right now. Since I have it. Bapara. Bapara is a role like the Egyptian women or midwives, like Moses's mother / sister. And every one of the people that has a hand in saving Moses is a woman. That is what the Bible says happens, so that Moses could do what he had to do. But it was only the women that helped him. And in a weird way, even the slave girl who goes out and brings the basket back. This is an amazing scene, this scene of the Nile. Because we already read about what the Nile meant to the Egyptians for food. We read about that in Genesis. We actually read about the Nile at the very beginning of creation, because it's also it's one of the rivers that feeds the Garden of Eden. But the Nile is this place that Moses is going to literally be rescued out of. And then when he comes back to rescue the people, that is his plague of turning the Nile to blood, the first plague. And think about what it means for her to spy the basket among the reeds. The reeds along the Nile. Because much later on, when Moses was going to lead the people across the Sea of Reeds, Yamsu, the reeds, the water, come back into play for Moses' life. And so the Nile, the water, the Red Sea, much later on, towards the end of his life, in Parshat Hukat, when he strikes the whole rock, instead of speaking to the rock, and the water is, the water winds up being the reason why he can't lead the people in. About how much water is in this guy's life. Water, which is the source of life for Moses, because this is how he was rescued. And here's the great scene, continues again, his adoption. His sister said to Pharaoh's daughter, "Shall I go get you a Hebrew nurse to suckle the child for you?" And Pharaoh's daughter answered, "Yes." So the girl went and called the child's mother. And Pharaoh said to her, "Take this child and nurse it for me, and I will pay your wages." So the woman took the child and nursed it. 9 verses. That's all we know about Moses' upbringing. Because I won't ruin it for you when I tell you what the next verse says. When the child grew up, she brought to Pharaoh's daughter, who made him her son, and she named him Moses, explaining, "I drew him from the water," which again they say is Moshe, from born of, associated with Masha, draw out. I drew him out of the water. And then the next line says, sometime after that, Moses grown up. 10 verses, folks. That's it. That's Moses' birth and him being adopted. But look at what happens when she adopts him. When she says, when Miriam, or it doesn't say Miriam, but when the sister says to Pharaoh's daughter, "Let me get you a Hebrew nurse to suckle," right? Nurse it for you. I've got a woman who will do it. Now, let's assume that Pharaoh's daughter is not a stupid woman. She's a very nice woman. Let's also assume she's not a stupid woman. She just let Moses go back to his own mother. Most likely she knew that. What we forget is that Moses lived with his mother until we would assume he grew up. Now, normally in those days, we know that the time of weaning is about 3 or 4 years. That's when people will be done nursing. I know people are thinking about, look, there are people who say you're supposed to do it longer than that today. I'm not going to get into the politics of that, but we know based on other texts of the Bible that it's like 3 or 4 years. It seems it's about 3 or 4 years. So that means he's about 4. On the other hand, I will point out that if she has to bring Moses back when he's done nursing, maybe he was nursing until he was 13. Because if you know that you don't get to see your son anymore once he's weaned, that's going to keep him longer. We read about Samuel, whose mother, Hannah, brings him to the temple to serve Eli when he's weaned. So this idea that, kids would sometimes be brought up outside the house, we have other versions of this. His being raised in his own home, though, is something we don't oftentimes think about. Because even if he came to live with the Pharaoh's daughter after he's 3 or 4 years old, 5 years old, it means that his mother got to spend time with him in a critical time, that it's very possible that Moses always knew who he was. And he never really lost contact with his mother. Doesn't say that anywhere, that he never got to see his mom again. But we generally are left with that because every movie we've ever seen about Moses seems to imply that in this next line, sometime after that, when Moses had grown up, he went out to his kinsfolk and witnessed their labor. He saw an Egyptian beating a Hebrew, one of his kinsmen. And nowhere does it say that Moses had no idea who this was. Nowhere does it say that he just was all of a sudden shocked by this brutality and violence. Maybe at some point, Moses was just sick and tired of watching his own people get beaten up. Now, we don't like that because it doesn't create the drama of an Egyptian prince who just gets, this revelation, some moment where he just says, this isn't right. And by the way, that's not based on the Ten Commandments or the Prince of Egypt. Remember, the Prince of Egypt, he's actually raised with Ramses in the same house. He doesn't know who he is until he meets by accident, his sister and his brother, and she sings him a lullaby and reminds him who he is. And that sets off and triggers this memory, which, by the way, they don't have him being raised by his mom and the Prince of Egypt. They don't have that because that takes away the drama of this revelation that he has. But the rabbis liked it because all these midrashim are based on this idea that Moses really doesn't know who he is. He's raised as an Egyptian and then decides he doesn't want to be an Egyptian anymore when he sees the brutality, or again, this trigger that happens when he sees someone beating a Hebrew. Now, this idea is that maybe he was sheltered in the kingdom and didn't see this until he went out one day and saw what these guys were actually doing. So that when he was living in a court, he didn't have to see it. When he finally sees it one day, that's when he flips out. That's a whole lot different than the other possibility, which is that he's always known what it's like. He's kind of looked back and forth between both places, and just at some point, he just doesn't want to put up with it anymore. Because the next line is, he turned this way and that, and seeing no one about, he struck down the Egyptian and hid him in the sand. Which, by the way, shows it's completely premeditated. Why? Because he looked both ways before he killed him to make sure no one was there. The idea that he didn't know what he was doing is not borne out by what the actual text says, which is that Moses very much knew what he was doing. He wanted to make sure no one could see it, know about it, and then he killed him. That's what it says. Look, in the movie The Prince of Egypt, it's even weirder because they have Moses pushing the guy off the scaffolding, and that's the way the Egyptian guy dies. And then Ramses, his brother, says, oh, it's like, we'll make it so like it never happened. No one cares about this. No one will ever know. It's not what the Bible says. That's not what the Bible says happens. But I will tell you again, the Midrash itself, the traditional Midrash likes this idea that Moses does not, for at least a good part of his life, have any connection to his own people and doesn't really care what's happening to his own people. And so there's wonderful midrashim, piles and piles. We actually studied them a couple of years ago. The midrashim about what Moses does in Pharaoh's court is that he's an architect for Pharaoh, or that he's a general for Pharaoh, that he leads the Egyptians into battles, that he has a whole other life as an Egyptian warlord, as an Egyptian leader, before he becomes a Jewish leader. What are these based on? These are based on old stories of Moses essentially being an Egyptian before he was a Hebrew, which has led some people to believe that Moses was an Egyptian all along. But the whole idea of him being a Hebrew was invented. That's the theory that Freud puts forward, which is not his theory, but was based on other writers at the time in Germany, 100, 120, 130 years ago, who said, well, it seems as though Moses is an Egyptian who just kind of leads a revolt, slave revolt. Look, I mean, I understand why people like that idea, but it's not, it doesn't have, I mean, that's as ridiculous as this idea that Moses never knows who he really is. I think it's much more plausible that Moses does know who he is, either has to grow up and has to have some sense of independence and some sense of strength on his own that he can actually do what he does in this moment. But it kind of goes against the drama of the idea that he lived between two worlds and was either never really wanted to go over to that Hebrew side, or he gave up everything to be a Hebrew. I mean, that's a possibility. I mean, he says he was raised by it says Pharaoh's daughter made him her son. But how much Moses knew about his own life, we don't know. It's not there. Again, I made this point many times. In the movie, The 10 Commandments, this takes roughly an hour and a half to get to this point. And that's for real. It's about 90 minutes. And so how does DeMille get 90 minutes out of 11 verses? Because he used the Midrash. And the Midrash was plentiful. But I also think what's interesting about this is that we've always projected onto Moses in this story our own issues. Because almost every time the Jewish people made it and assimilated and got into a culture, each one of us, someone real powerful, had a moment where they had to decide who they are. Am I an Egyptian or am I a Jew? They have to choose a side. And so that's why the drama of this is so powerful, because almost every generation, unless the Jewish people were completely segregated or completely, separated or completely independent of any other culture, this issue of having to single out and to spell out and be confronted with a moment where you actually have to pick a side is very powerful. And I think people have felt that in many ways. And was there a moment where somebody, in almost every generation where somebody had to say, well, I'm a Jew. I can't let this happen to my people. Even if I have to risk my job, even if I have to risk my position, even if I have to risk my influence and my wealth, I have to do something at this point. So the rabbis like that idea. They like this idea that Moses actually had a dilemma. And we'll finish with this right now. Turn this way, that way. So Noah struck it down, killed him. And by the way, he hit him. He buried him. You want anyone to see? It's not like he gave him a burial. He hit him. He dug a hole, buried him out in the desert. It's like something happens in Vegas. But here's the problem. When he went out the next day, he found two Hebrews fighting. And so he said to the offender, "Why do you strike your fellow?" So the next day he sees a Hebrew fighting, or two Hebrews fighting. Somebody's hurting somebody else, and he says to the guy who's hurting the other person, "Why are you striking your fellow? Why are you striking your probably kinsman?" Right? Is that the King James?
Fellow.
Oh, fellow. They use fellow. It's re'echa, which is kinsman and your relative. Your fellow. Okay. He retorted, "Who made you chief and ruler over us? Do you mean to kill me as you killed the Egyptian?" Moses was frightened and thought, "Then the matter is known." And when Pharaoh heard of the matter, he sought to kill Moses. But Moses fled from Pharaoh. He arrived in the land of Midian and sat down beside Bor. And that, my friends, is how we're ending today. 15 verses into chapter 2. And Moses, by this point, is about 40 years old, 35, 40, something like that. He's an adult male, and all we know about him is 15 verses. So when I tell you we don't know about Moses from the Torah, you just saw what I'm talking about. This is it. His birth story is about 5 verses before he gets put in the 3 verses before he gets put in the Nile. A few verses of him in the Nile. It's actually the longest part of it. The dialogue over that. Literally, the dialogue over him in the Nile is most of what we know about him. Because the next time we know about him gets returned. I mean, next time we see him or see his face, he's old enough to go back to Pharaoh's daughter. And then we see him going out, and we have 3 verses of him striking the guy, and that's it. Let's see, 1, 2, 3, 4 verses. 4 verses of him in Egypt as the prince of Egypt. 4 verses of him as an adult young man in Egypt. 4 verses. So we don't know anything about it from the Bible. We don't know why he's slow of speech. We'll get to that if we get the cold. We don't get anything about who he is. And my friends, we don't even know his name. And since John brought up the issue of names of Shifra and Pua, I will tell you, how do we not know Moses' name? Because his name, Moses came to him to Pharaoh's daughter. The first 4 years, 5 years, is another name. That was definitely that. So, what was Moses' name? And there's Midrash about what was real Moses. What was Moses' name? What was Moshe's real name? The great thing about this name of Moses is that it's the most Egyptian name you could possibly have. And we don't even know what his real full name was because the Bible edited it out.
So you say even
We don't know what his name is. We don't know what his birth name is, and we don't really know what his full name was. Because the Bible tells us his name was Moshe because she took him out of the water, Mesh, which isn't what it means, which is why the note here says born of, because Moshe goes with something else. It goes with the name of an Egyptian god who we don't know. And his mother knew it because she took him out of the Nile, and maybe she named him after the Nile god Sobek, or maybe she named him after one of the other gods that's associated with the Nile, because the Nile is really big in Egypt. And so a lot of gods have attachments to the Nile. But was it Ramoses, Ramses? Was it Tutmosis, which is from the god Tut? We don't know, because people didn't want to know what Egyptian god Moses was named after, because it's an Egyptian god. And God forbid we have a god that's attached to the greatest hero of Jewish history, isn't it? But there was. And so the irony is we don't really know who he was named after, what Egyptian god was named after, because all we have is born of. We know his Hebrew name is born of, or his Egyptian name. The name we call him in the Bible is he's born of. Who's he born of? It's a mystery. So that's perhaps the greatest name mystery we have in the Bible, is that we don't know Moses' real full name. We don't know his birth name, and we don't know what his name was when he was born. He was born of. That's what his name means, born of. And look, I mean, it's not like this translation didn't tell us that. So it's a very interesting dilemma, one that we can imagine. When we also know the Bible very often suppresses the name of gods. They're all the time. Sometimes they come in there. Sometimes there's gods that, sometimes the name Baal gets in there. But sometimes, as we saw in the book of Samuel, it's Boshet. The shame. We don't say that name. We say shame instead of the name. And we say Boshet instead of Baal. Don't say Baal. But we don't know. We don't know what this God's name was. We did not preserve it. Instead, we know him as Moses. And You've met Moses in 15 verses, and now when we come back next week, we'll read about him as an adult man. But I promise you, that by the end of chapter 2, which is 10 verses from now, you still won't know Moses. You won't know anything about Moses from the Bible. You have to look at the Midrash. You have to imagine. You have to fill in the blanks. You have to understand it. The greatest hero of Jewish history. We don't know what his life was like, really. We don't know what his life was like. Not his childhood, not his marriage, not his family life. It's not in the Bible. So, with that,
Much best kids.
think about that. Think about why. We don't know. But we'll see next week Moses get married. So the good news is, very bad story in chapter 1. But we do get a good story in chapter 2, which is the birth of Moses and the rise of our great leader, who is more complicated. We learn about maybe some of his motivations, and we learn about some of his fears, and we learn about what makes him angry. We don't really know much about his personal life. So we will see you next week. Any other announcements we want to make? Oh, get your ballots in, everybody. Ballot up. Ballot up.
Voted for,
All right.
Freddie Freeman.
Bye-bye. I got my ballot and see who else from there. We do both at the same time. Take care, everybody. It was good seeing you all. Stay healthy. And
Thank you
Thank you. Thanks, Rabbi.
very much.
thanks.
Thanks, Rabbi.
Bye.
Bye.